Hi, everyone. Welcome to ESOP Radio. I'm Trevor Gilmore, CEO of Menke. This is a great one today. We have Joe Belsterling, CEO of Certified EO on today. Certified EO is a Menke partner that independently certifies employee-owned companies and provides education to the leaders of those successful employee-owned companies. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Trevor. Really excited for our conversation today and grateful for the opportunity to come on.
Okay, let's dive in. So, Joe, let's start by telling our listeners a little about you and the story of Certified EO and the work that you all do at Certified EO.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got to first give a shout out and credit to the founders of Certified EO. So I am not the founder of Certified EO. I'm shepherding on the legacy of them in the next chapter. But it was an individual named Thomas and Kramer. And they really started it, from my understanding, out of research at the time in a master's program around the economic and really just cultural benefits and work benefits of employee ownership as a concept. And there was a trend for types of associations around certification like the B Corp industry or the B Corp association, and thought something similar could help grow the space of employee ownership and ESOPs and other forms of ownership as well. I had a little bit of a parallel story. So I had a previous educational technology company that I had founded, and we were not a formal ESOP, but we were involved in employee ownership through direct ownership. And so we had a large percentage of the company that I had given to our employees through direct ownership. And ultimately that business ended up getting acquired 3 or 4 years ago. And I always tell people that, when I started that company, I thought that what would stay with me for the rest of my life was the social impact and the social mission, which was educational around career exploration and academic planning and helping kids figure out what they wanted to do with their life. And we served over 6.5 million kids. And so I thought that's going to be my crowning achievement that I hold on to. But after exiting that business, what I actually realized that has stayed with me the most is the employee impact, right? And the employee relationships. Like most of our students, the millions of kids who used it, I'm sure they got value, I'm sure they got benefit, and we're very proud of that. But 2, 3, 4 years down the road, they probably don't even remember the name of the career exploration tool they used back in their sophomore year or junior year of high school. But for the employees I got to mentor and grow alongside and watch develop and build their own flourishing careers and then financially benefit from that and be really positively impacted and set up their next chapters of life or buy their family's first house or be able to take time off from working. Those are the things that have stayed with me and will stay with me for the rest of my life. And I think about pretty much every day and am incredibly proud of. And so there was this intersection where I was kind of looking for the next thing and had met Thomas and Kramer and already was passionate about employee ownership from that perspective. And so was able to come into Certified EO almost 2 years ago now and serve as president and CEO. And I am really just grateful for that opportunity and excited for where we're headed.
Congrats on building the education company. It sounds like you really helped students grow, right, over time, figuring out, hey, the life path, smart decisions, and so on. You said 6.5 million students touched that.
Yeah, it was 5,000 schools and 6.5 million kids had used the platform when the business was acquired.
That's impressive. And personal note here, way back in 2016, I remember meeting Kramer and Thomas in Oakland back when they were first starting Certified EO, and it was an idea. And we met over coffee downtown Oakland with John Menke, our founder, and it was super excited to hear their idea and what they planned to do. And then they launched Certified EO and really grew it, scaled it, and then you came in, 2 years ago, and are here to take it to the next level. So exciting stuff. It's been really fun to see the organization grow. And for listeners who may not be familiar with Certified EO and its designation, what does it mean to earn that credential? Number one. And two, you see the logo on products out there for employee-owned companies. You see the Certified EO, it's kind of a circular logo, et cetera. Let's talk about that and the power of that logo for consumers. And then also, Joe, what intrigued you to acquire Certified EO, given your background in education and so on, and with your future plan, for your own personal journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So starting off with the certification piece and kind of the origin of where this all started. As I said, I know a big inspiration for Thomas and Kramer was kind of the B Corp Association and what had been done there, but also kind of fair trade labels and the impact that was having on consumer behavior, right? And to your point, it's always really cool and kind of a pinch me moment when I see a random truck on the highway with our certified employee owned trademark on it. Or, I went to a hotel, the Tabard Inn in DC that had the mark everywhere, or you see it on Lighthouse products in the grocery store. And so that's really cool to see how far that's come and just see it in the wild. And the importance of that, to your question on why does that matter, is, there's a lot of flavors of employee ownership. And I do want to be clear on something, and sometimes I've encountered folks in the space who maybe don't always agree. But in my view, the more employee ownership in any shape, size, or form, the better, right? The more that employees are empowered and aligned to the economic incentives of the companies they work for and can share in that growth and upside, the better. But it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all model, right? It's not 6 of one, half dozen of another. The models do have differences in their value. A huge factor is the liquidity of those shares. If you work at a high growth tech startup that's raising tons of money and awarding employee options, but ends up bankrupting, or not even bankrupting, but being acquired for below the last, share price strike price of your options, that stock has no value. And even if the company's doing well, but is staying profit, if there's no tender offers or no repurchase rights or anything like that, that stock has no liquid value. It's not like getting shares in a publicly traded company as part of your compensation package, right? And so from our perspective, all employee ownership is a great thing. And we love seeing it in any shape, size, and form, but it isn't all created equal. And we wanted to create something that was kind of a third-party outside point of view around the thresholds of employee ownership that, in our view, had the most significant benefit for employees and the most protections from the perspective of the employee around, repurchase rights and obligations, which ESOPs obviously have, and the percent of ownership. Giving 1% of the company to an ESOP plan is very different than 30% or 50%, or in the best case scenario, 100%. And so that's what that certification stands for. It's allowing companies to say, hey, we're not just claiming to be employee owned, but really it's because all 5 of our family members who own the company are also employees. We had an outside body look at our kind of ownership structure, and it's broad-based, it's equal, it's fair. Everyone who works here has access to it with the same vesting requirements. There's potential liquidity at the end of the road for employees, and there's a significant percentage of the company that is employee-owned. And that's what that certification does. The last thing I'll add is, what excites me and where we're going and why I got interested with my education background is actually exactly that. So the organization started off on that certification side, but as it grew, it realized that the biggest value it was providing or could provide to its members was really help with the implementation of what we talk about as participative management. So data's come out recently that shows one of the big deciding factors between whether employee-owned companies outperform peers or underperform peers is participative management. Having your employees act and think like owners and be bought into the concept of ownership and understand what it means. And the certification in and of itself isn't enough. And so we've really leaned into and grown into educational offerings, content offerings, community building, measuring engagement toolkits, and things like that. And I think that's where our future will continue to grow. And we're really excited to serve the employee-owned industry.
The ESOP and really any sort of employee ownership, is very much an education first, process, right? To understand why a company should go there, especially if you're a controlling shareholder and so on. So the fact that you have this education background, it's going to help out a lot in my opinion, when you scale up certified EO. And so education first makes a lot of sense. To back up a bit, you're talking about startups issuing, stock and so on. Often we see that in ISOs, restricted units. And the goal there is to take the company through acquisition or IPO, right? And then you get your payday and so on, and you're happy. SpaceX, We're recording this July 1, 2026. SpaceX just went public a little over 2 weeks ago. You read about, the employee wealth and so on. More of a, I would say, medium-term focus there. The employee ownership that we all see in our industry, we're talking about long-term ownership, right? And viewing it for the long term, building that long-term equity, long-term wealth. So totally different focus for these companies, for the management, for the employees versus the companies that are venture funded, maybe PE funded, and it's more of a short-term focus and not necessarily the ownership mindset. It's more, hey, let's scale this thing, and try to cash in at the highest price, move on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also just a question of risk and reward, right? And like one of the things we talk to with members a lot, or folks who aren't yet ESOPs, but is the seriousness of the commitment of being an ESOP because of the repurchase obligations, because of the wealth building components, right? Whereas in the venture world, the folks who are funding those companies expect to write off 7, 8, 9 out of 10 of their investments. And so it's a question of, are you maximizing the company's chance of success? Or are you maximizing your chance of having 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 investments become a 1,000x return that pays for all the losses? And, there's pros and cons to everything in life, right? And there's like merits for our economy to all types of business. But to your point, it's just a very different thing. And I think that's where kind of the need for the certification in our eyes came from, was this is a unique form of longevity, to your point, but also employee protections built into it. And it's important to recognize that and call that out and give that credit. And it doesn't mean, giving stock options or profit sharing bonuses or anything like that in any other type of company is a bad thing. That's still great for those employees. But this is a unique and special thing. And we want a set of standards that can really bring visibility to that and credibility to that from an outside perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I often say, and when I talk to business owners who approach us asking, hey, is an ESOP good for us? One key thing is, a company better off staying independent? If the answer is yes, ESOP, EO probably makes tons of sense, right? And it's kind of a loaded question. So what does it mean to stay independent? It means the company has a moat, it has strong cash flows, has a culture in place. It's better off staying independent than being part of a large organization, maybe a competitor, large public company, private equity roll up, and so on. And that's the world we all play in, and it's fun because these are companies that have high intention and stay in the course. They have motivated employees who have skin in the game. And let's talk about that aspect here of employees having skin in the game. So, Joe, in your experience, what's the single most powerful thing that changes inside a company once employees become owners? And this can be culturally, operationally, or financially, or the intersection of all three.
Yeah, I was going to say, I really think it's the intersection of all three. And so one of the things I've always talked about within the companies that I've run is what it actually means to be an owner. And I think that's the most powerful change that happens when people understand what it means to be an owner and actually act and think like that, because it shows up in how the company runs financially. It shows up obviously in the culture, but it shows up how the company runs operationally. I'll sit down with all of my employee bases and explain like, hey, when you're an owner, you get a lot of perks, but it comes with a lot of responsibilities. Meaning, if I have to go to a doctor's appointment in the middle of the day, I don't need anybody to approve my time off request, right? If I have a family emergency popped up, I don't even think about work. I just handle my family emergency. And it has that flexibility because I'm not answering to anybody. I'm not reporting to anybody. I don't need someone to approve my actions. But on the flip side, if we have a big partnership or a big problem pops up and it's Friday at 8 p.m., the buck stops with me. I don't get to just say, oh, it's somebody else's problem, right? And I'm working through the weekend to fix that and make sure that works. And, all businesses function like a bank account. And I don't just mean financially with your customers. I mean culturally and operationally. You're constantly making withdrawals and you're constantly making deposits. And when a business makes more withdrawals than deposits, it heads towards bankruptcy financially. But those same things apply towards culture and towards operations. So if all of your employees, I remember a moment with major clarity. I've always instilled ownership cultures coupled with financial incentives where our employees were all making way more withdrawals than they were deposits into the company. Everyone was like, hey, this newfound freedom and trust is amazing. We're going to take advantage of it, cut corners. And the work wasn't getting done and our clients were being impacted and the business would have been drastically impacted if it continued. And we had a meeting where I was honest and called everyone out on that. And I said, you guys are taking all the perks and not stepping up with the responsibilities. You want your coworkers to cover for you when you want to be off the ball, but when they're off the ball, you're not covering from them. So it doesn't work. There's no circle, of life here because nobody's making deposits to cover all the withdrawals that you're making. And I actually had multiple employees come up to me after that meeting and cry and apologize because they were like, it wasn't intentional. They weren't bad people, but it was just, hey, no one's ever given me this freedom. This is awesome. I'm going to take advantage of it. And, being a little bit absent-minded and a little bit selfish. And from there on, we never had that problem again, and if you couldn't show up to work for Thursday because you weren't in the right headspace, we trusted you. You didn't need to make an excuse. You didn't need to explain it. But your 5 colleagues would stay an extra hour or 2 after work to make sure the work got done because they knew when they needed the day, you would do the same. And when that change happens, when people truly think like an owner, both on the privilege side, because it makes a career more sustainable and have more longevity and more reward, but also on the responsibility side. And when people start focusing on depositing more into the company bank account culturally, operationally, and financially than they're withdrawing from it because they know in the long term that will benefit them, that's when something really changes internally in a company and that ownership culture can really fuel incredible results.
The bank account analogy is powerful. It's one that hits home and is easily understood. It's an awesome example there. Joe, would you say is there a concentration of industries amongst your customer base? I mean, we see it at Menke. Certain industries just are ideal fits for ESOPs, and so on. But ESOP at the end of the day, it's just a shareholder, right? So it can literally work for any company. But do you see across all your customers any concentration of industries?
To two of your earlier points, one about businesses that are better to stay independent versus maybe getting acquired by a roll-up or things like that. You'll see industries that correlate with more independence, less consolidation than maybe some other industries, right? Like you look at the Amazons and the Googles, there's tons of consolidation because you have to be so massive to play in the space of building servers and hosting and things like that.
Each CapEx, you need to have that capital, the billions to build the data centers, invest in AI, and so
totally.
on.
Yeah. I'm not starting a local small business in Richmond, Virginia that's going to offer an equivalent data center hosting option to Amazon, right? But a lot of the other industries, retail, hospitality, trades, services, things like that, there is the advantage in actually being local and having those relationships. And even in a lot of situations, lower costs and lower supply chain complexity and things like that from being local or regional. So I would say we do probably see more of those types of businesses, maybe ones that rely on services or trades or supply chain. But also to your point, ESOPs can be for everyone. And it's not like we have an overwhelming concentration of only one type of industry or one type of business. We see everything from, I just met with a company that does yacht sales and brokering to trades, to tech, to retail, to hospitality, to grocery stores or gas station chains, to restaurant groups. And so we do see ESOPs and other employee ownership structures vastly across the board. But you will see a little bit more of the types of businesses that are more likely to stay independent or be able to compete on a local or regional or, semi-national level instead of those massive monopolies.
Yeah. And at a simple level, I like to say, if the IP is your employee base, you're probably a good ESOP fit. If your IP is tech and so on, it's hard to compete with the Mag now 10, right? I mean, just at a high level, that's...
Yeah.
But if your IP is your employees, meaning the human capital is what makes the company hum, and obviously we're in the age of AI. Everyone is worried and kind of freaked out. Hey, what does AI mean for employees and so on? I think smart ESOP companies are going to thrive because they're already figuring out how to leverage it. At the end of the day, humans, in my opinion, figure out human problems. We're going to be there to solve human problems. Same thing with sales. People like to buy still from humans at the end of the day. So AI will certainly streamline a lot of maybe recurring tasks, it's amazing for research, and so on, right? But smart ESOP companies and just smart companies as a whole, the humans are going to leverage that to their benefit and just we're going to see efficiency increases and so on. I want to ask a question. So we're taking a look at a study that Rutgers put out a couple weeks back, and they did this study that went back, I think, 20 years that highlighted the fact that employee-owned companies on average have a 7 to 10% higher productivity rate than non-ESOP companies. And if you compound that over time, we're talking about a tremendous efficiency increase. And then we see that over time in the stock price growth too. And I talked to a lot of clients who have 10, 13% on average stock price appreciation for the long term. One of my clients for over 40 years, average is 13% a year. So the employees that got stock and ran that company and rode that wave, and the company's still performing awesome. They're getting that accruing. So do you see that in your customer base, the efficiency increase? Is that part of something at Certified EO you all are researching or having that discussion with your employee-owned customers? Because that's an interesting one that is relatively new, is proving out, hey, the ESOP really does increase employee productivity and efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. And coupled with what you saw, I think in the last month or two, I saw a new article come out that was citing 17% compounded annual growth in stock prices on the ESOP Stout Index, compared to what the Russell 2000 and S&P and stuff have seen. And so there's a lot of data that's come out in different flavors, focused on different sectors or industries, or even the data that came out post-COVID around lower layoff rates and higher resiliency and things like that, right? And so I think there's a lot of data that's come out that's shown employee ownership isn't just a feel-good, like philanthropic strategy. It's actually a business strategy, right? But to your question on where we're leaning into that, it's not as built out of a data set yet because it hasn't been as studied or tested, but there is some findings, and this gets back to something I mentioned earlier, where like the causal factor there is actually that participative management piece. And so the employee-owned companies that become employee-owned and then set it and forget it, and sometimes we'll come across those folks who we are excited or hopeful for the opportunity to help them, but they're like, we've been an employee-owned company for 10 years. We send out this statement share price every year. Most people don't even read it. They don't really know what it means, etc. You're not getting any of the uplift from being employee owned there because your employees don't understand it. They don't internalize it. They're not showing up differently. They're not acting differently. Whereas when your employees know, one of the content projects we'll do for folks talks about what moves the share price. And it's not, rocket science. It's not getting into the weeds of really technical financial stuff. It's very simple, but it's, hey, if you can come up with if you're a, fleet supervisor or in logistics or a driver, and you can come up with an idea by consolidating stops or this or that saves every driver 15 minutes a day, and the average driver makes, $40,000 or $50,000, then over 260 working days, that's $1,000 to $1,500 per driver. If you have 100 drivers or 1,000 drivers, you're talking about 150,000 to 1.5 million in savings. And if your company trades at 5 times profit, to keep it really simple, right? You just added $750,000 to the valuation with 100 drivers. And so getting employees to actually understand those things, like that's where you see those long-term success stories of a company compounding growth at 10 to 15 to 20% every year because their entire workforce is acting and thinking like an owner and showing up differently. And it's their pocketbook they're protecting, not some, removed arbitrary person in a boardroom who they don't know.
Exactly. And that's how you get real change as well at these companies, is getting everyone to start understanding, okay, these micro changes that I do in aggregate, to your point, one simple change could lead to a stock price increase of 750,000, a million more. On a recent podcast, I had Dave Jager, CEO of our client Legacy Utility Group. They're based here in California. They basically do all the heavy pipeline, et cetera, under roadways all over California. And they're expanding as well to all over the West Coast, Nevada. There's stuff going on in Texas and so on. Really cool company. But we helped them go ESOP, a minority ESOP, back in early 2025. And immediately, because they have these trucks and, gas price, et cetera, the tie, right? And so on. So the drivers, instead of letting these big rigs idle at job sites, they turn off the engine. Whereas in the past, they just let them idle. So you do that aggregate across the base, and you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of savings in gas. And to your point, if you're a 5, 6, 7x multiple company, bam, you're talking about a couple million extra value there. And since employees get the statements every year, They see that stock price and they know what's behind it. And that's the magic behind this whole thing. When you get everyone understanding what makes up that stock price and how everyone's collective actions drive that, then the company's going to do well.
Absolutely. That's an incredible story and an even better example of the theoretical content piece I just shared in the real life scenario. And, sometimes we'll encounter, I wouldn't say pushback because nobody's against it, but maybe skepticism, especially for companies that maybe have folks who aren't on computers a lot, or a big part of their workforce isn't in email, it's out in the field. And maybe a CFO perspective is, I can't pull up our P&L. They're not going to pay attention. Their eyes are going to roll over. They're not going to care. And it's like, you don't have to take it to level, 1,000 out of 10 to explain these concepts. You don't need to pull up the entire investment banking model and valuation model to say, this is how it moves the needle, right? To your point and my point, you can just say, hey, if you find a way to consume less gas, then for every dollar you save, multiply it by the number of people in your position and then multiply it by 6. And that's how much it adds to the valuation. That's a very simplistic way to explain these things, but you can do that for every section of your workforce. You can do it in the warehouse. You can do it in the retail store. You can do it in your graphic design department. You can do it with your drivers. You can do it anywhere, on construction sites, etc. And it's incredibly powerful. And so when the people have the financial incentive of participating in that upside and the educational awareness to know what to look out for, that's where you really see the magic happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of the household economics analogy too. Power is expensive these days, like, electricity, gas, everything. So being smarter, even with the household's economics, right? That translates that same thinking. Okay, you have a budget. How do you operate within this? How do you cut back if expenses are going up due to, energy, all these things beyond your control? How do you manage that? That same thinking applies easily to a business. And to your point, you don't need an investment banking model and, people coming in, McKinsey types coming in and telling you how to do it. It's like most people already have this logic in their head. They just need to know how to apply it.
Totally. 100%.
In the business context.
Yeah.
And be told it's okay to apply it as well.
And be asked, not even just told it's okay, but be asked to apply it. Be asked to say, hey, you're an owner. We need all of you to go out and look for savings or look for this or look for that. What ideas do you have? What ways do you have to do things more efficiently? A lot of times the folks on the ground who are actually doing the work have way more insight and way more data collection than the leadership team making the decision, because the data is filtered through 4, 5, 6, 7 layers, depending on how big the company is, by the time it gets up to the CEO, right? And so empowering and even asking and letting them know it's an expectation or a desire is a huge catalyst for all of this.
And that definitely leads us to the next question here. So an ESOP at the end of the day is it's a legal structure. And I always tell prospects, our customers, and so on, what is the ESOP? There's a lot of questions and, comments about what an ESOP is. But at the end of the day, it's just the shareholder. It's technically a legal structure. It's housed in a trust and so on, but it's also much more than that. And that's the culture component that we're talking about here. So ownership culture is something you have to build deliberately. And also it can be a bit hard to change as well, because often companies that have been in existence 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Some of our clients have been in business 1880. They started 1880, they're an ESOP, which is awesome. So it's 2026. So they've been in business now 146 years, right? And the culture, no doubt, has helped that company thrive during that period. But what is culture, right? So what are the companies that do this well, meaning building the ownership culture smart, deliberately, and effectively? What are they actually doing differently than those just that have the paperwork, meaning, okay, they go ESOP, but nothing else changes, and if it's a strong culture, maybe nothing needs to change, right? Because they have it already in place. But you do see the outliers in the data. You mentioned the valuation data that said, hey, 17, 18% growth. I mean, that's outperforming. That's even outperforming the S&P, right? So they're doing something well in that situation versus the ones that go ESOP is just kind of languish. So Joe, what would you say is that secret sauce that separates those that do it well versus those that just have it, but they don't do anything with it?
Yeah. I'm going to keep this one simple as well, just mostly because I'm not nearly as intelligent as a lot of the policy and regulatory experts on the inner workings of ESOPs, and I'm still learning from all of those around me every day. But because of my personal limitations, it probably reflects on the messaging we share with clients. But I also think keeping things simple can be a recipe for having it be more impactful and easier to implement. And so what I would say we come back to a lot at Certified EO is a couple kind of key bullet points. The first is, does everybody understand how they can impact the share price and how the share price impacts them? So this is everything we've already been talking about, right? But like when you look at what are those key cultural things that actually make an ESOP beyond just the legal structure, that's the first bucket. If your employees don't know how the share price impacts them and they don't know how they impact the share price, they're not really owners and they can't really act like an owner, right? The second I would say is trust and transparency. A lot of times, and I get it, and I've seen it, and I've experienced it firsthand myself, but a lot of times you'll have hesitancy from a CFO to say, well, yeah, but if we go out there and say our EBITDA is $3 million or $5 million or $8 million a year, every one of my employees is going to come to me the next day and say, well, I need a raise and I need this and I need that. And I've seen some of that play out myself, and I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but even if that is a challenge, you have to figure out how to get around that, because you can't have a culture of ownership without trust and transparency. If folks don't know, it doesn't mean every week you have to be reporting on everything to everyone. But if at a high level, quarterly, annually, whatever it is, folks don't know how the business is doing and what's impacting it, they're not really an owner and they're not going to feel like an owner. And there's ways around that, right? You don't have to just throw out the big high level number. You can say, hey guys, I know this looks like a lot, but we do 5 million in EBITDA, but we have this seller financing or this debt from the ESOP, and we need to pay down $1 million of that a year. And so that takes it to 4. And also we're a working capital intensive business. And so we need to always leave $1 million to $2 million buffer for materials or this or that. So that takes this down. Then lastly, we have a savings rate of 30%, because if economic times change or we hit a hard patch, we don't want to have to do layoffs. We want to protect your job. And so we're really only left with 250 to 500K of discretionary money. And if we spread that out across, our 250 employees or 500 employees, it wouldn't move the needle as much as investing in growth to increase the share price for you. So we use that for new experiments, right? Like you can explain these things in simple ways that help mitigate that concern of folks wanting a piece of it per se. But if you just put your foot down and don't do anything with transparency and updates, it's really tough to get people to feel like owners, because they still don't really know what's going on and they still feel at an arm's length from the business. And then the last piece I would say is being comfortable with bumps, right? Like more often than not, sometimes you meet the perfect story, everything goes great. But more often than not, when you're building an ownership culture, it's going to ebb and flow. Right? It's like the story I shared with my first educational business where, we gave a lot of privilege to folks and it was taken advantage of. And then we had to go in the other direction. And there's going to be those adjustment periods, right? There's going to be the periods before your culture really gets what it means to be an owner, or maybe wants too much themselves, or doesn't think in the right way, or takes too big of risks, right? Is so empowered that they're like taking too big of swings and they're not panning out. And that's fine. Like any business owner goes through that same, every business I've had, I've made bad decisions on resource allocations or investments or what the right strategy was, but it's a learning process and you have to be comfortable with experiencing that as an entire company. And I think those are the things that make an ESOP beyond the legal structure is, do your employees know how the share price impacts them and how they impact the share price? Do you have trust and transparency? And are you willing to kind of go through the ebbs and flows of a learning curve that any owner or CEO goes on? It's just now magnified because it's applied to your entire employee ownership base.
Exactly. And Joe, keeping it simple as you led with, that's my mantra as well, is simple is usually the right way to explain the power of the ESOP, and basically the power of employee ownership. And as you said, all employees understanding the financial metrics at a high level, transparency, and understanding as well their impacts and how they can move the needle. Let's talk about the cool tools you all have at Certified EO, because we talked a lot about what is culture, how do you get employee owners to think and drive performance, how do you make a good culture, one that's strong, that endures, that thrives over the long term. All great stuff, but I know you all have a lot of tools, especially with your train the trainer model you have at Certified EO. So what sort of products and tools do you have available for your customers that basically help them with this continuous process, of educating employee owners about all the benefits and even drawbacks, of ESOP and employee-owned companies?
Yeah, great question. So I would say the majority of our tools probably fall into kind of bullet one of my last answer. How can I impact the share price and how does the share price impact me, right? So we have infographics that we customize with branding, imagery, logos, vesting schedule details, company information for all of our members. And so a lot of times we'll get asked, well, how do you compare to other associations or this or that? And we're much more product focused, right? We are a membership network, but our value prop isn't a conference. It isn't a big meetup or the peer-to-peer pieces of that. It's content and tools that move the needle on that employee understanding and engagement. So that's kind of bucket one, is animations, videos, handouts that are fully customized to your company to help employees understand, how does our company work? How does an ESOP work? How does the share price get decided? How do distributions work? And what can I do to move the needle on the share price? What can I do to act and think like an owner? What does it mean? What are the responsibility pieces of being an owner and employee ownership culture on a macro level? The second piece of it is kind of interactive tools to really get to play out how this can affect them over the long term. So I love one of your earlier answers when we were talking about ownership structures, and you said, the ESOP structure is really about a long-term commitment to growth, right? It's not this go big or go home, high risk, high reward venture approach to business. And so most often, not always, but most often, the really impactful side of wealth building for an ESOP comes from compounding. There's all those running jokes of compounding's the eighth wonder of the world, right? And so when you have compounding over 15, 20, 25 years, it's insane. There's a quote in business that I love, which is, most people overestimate what can happen in 1 year and underestimate what can happen in 10 years, right? And so we have tools focused on really helping employees internalize that piece. We have an interactive wealth calculator that clearly disclaims it's not projections, but shows them, put in your account value, put in your salary, put in your benefit level, your share vesting, and see how this actually compounds over 15, 20, 30 years. We have educational content and information around that. And then we have tools around kind of eliminating that friction piece, right? And so we have an EO-based library page, or the transparency piece from my last answer, but it's eliminating the friction around the transparency. So we have an EO-based library page where companies can set up a really simple, easy to access online EO library for their company with content, the interactive wealth calculator, videos, animations. And so your employees can access that anywhere at any time. We hear often from folks, well, communication is such a tough barrier because not all of our employees even have emails when you're in like a retail or a field working environment, or they don't access their computer. They're on a construction site all day. And so having a unique, protected, secure link with no friction, no login, that houses all of this for employees and can be their one-stop shop, can really help eliminate the friction around the transparency piece and sharing that information out. And then I would say the last piece of it is toolkits around the train the trainer piece of it. So we have webinars, we have a toolkit on measuring engagement, which we found is a big lacking area for employee-owned companies, right? If you're going to lean into being an ownership culture, you need to measure that. You need to have that show up in your performance reviews. You need to have that be a part of what you're actually paying attention to. And so we have a full toolkit built around measuring engagement. We have toolkits built around setting up a committee. We do an annual benchmark to aggregate best practices and infuse that into our toolkits and content. And that's kind of the overview. There's a couple other pieces to it. We have a job board that generates 20,000 clicks a month for only employee-owned companies, and a couple other cool tools like that. But it really centers a lot on that education, that empowerment, and removing friction around bringing that transparency and education to employees.
So the job board, I know that you all released that a couple of years back. I love that. That's an innovative new tool. So it's, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's specifically for your member customers that anytime they have a job opening, they can go on and post that and basically on Certified EO. If you're a job hunter, so if you're looking for a new opportunity, you can go on and find opportunities at employee-owned companies. So you can search by employer, job title, and so on, and look at all those opportunities up there, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the thesis there is, everyone I think is in tune with some of the economic challenges our country's been facing with a K-shaped economy where asset appreciation is crazy, but you're seeing wage stagnation or other challenges like that. And we really believe employee ownership is going to be a massive competitive differentiator in recruitment. And folks are going to want to work at employee-owned companies over the coming years and even decades. And so aggregating that, and that actually goes full circle to one of your first questions, which is also where the certification matters. So because we're doing that certification on the front end, we can say these are truly employee-owned companies, not just somebody who's claiming to be. And then we can market that to the consumer world and everybody publicly as certified, verified employee-owned companies that are hiring. And our members actually don't even have to upload their jobs. They just give us the link where they post their jobs, and we have scrapers that automatically pull it in. And then when folks click on it, it sends it to their page to apply. And so it's a really simple process for our member, but yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome. So anyone listening that is in the job market, check it out. Go to Certified EO. Most ESOP companies pay market wages. I mean, they're competitive employers, so you're not going to be taking a haircut there. Key difference is you're going to get this extra equity that is just above and beyond your normal cash compensation package. Very unique to EO companies. Non-EO companies don't have that. So as Joe mentioned, power of compounding. Like let's say you get 10% extra accruing in this ESOP account every 10 years. If the stock price just goes up 7%, you basically are doubling, in value and so on. So it's real. We see meaningful ESOP wealth out there. So that's a cool tool that you all developed. I'm so glad you all did that. We need more innovation in the space. Thanks, Joe.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're excited about that. We're excited about the EO-based library page, and we have a couple other cool things in development for end of this year.
Awesome, Joe. So where can people find you?
Yeah. So certifiedeo.com. EO is just the singular letters. If you Google us, also on LinkedIn, we're Certified EO. And on our website, we have a newsletter sign up to get regular updates on what we're doing. To your point, the job board is linked on our website, so you can kind of bookmark that. And it's employeeownedjobs.com and always come back to that. And then interact with us on LinkedIn. You can follow us there and follow a lot of our updates and content we post there as well.
Excellent. And we're looking forward to integrating the full Certified EO products with all of our clients. So any Mickey client, customer listening, stay tuned for that. We're working on good stuff jointly here. So Joe, we're out of time today. Thank you for joining us today. And thanks to everyone for joining us as well. Please follow us for more episodes on your favorite podcast channel, whether that's Spotify, YouTube, Apple, or Mickey.com. We have all the videos posted up there. Take care, everyone. Have an awesome day.
Thanks a lot, Trevor.